Did you know it takes less than 10 minutes to read through the 4-chapter, 48-verse book of Jonah? I believe you should take that time because it's not only about the true account of a man swallowed by a sea creature and surviving 3 days and nights, but the book of Jonah also shows us how Yahweh describes himself, which comes from Exodus 34:6, how Yahweh is involved in the lives of his people through instruction and intervention, and Yahweh's compassion for not only his people, but for all people. Hopefully you'll see this as we take another clear, accurate, relevant, and edifying look at Jonah in real life, the domino effect. Today's message focuses on when we forget to forgive. Quick background to make sure you catch up with right where we are. The book opens with Yahweh instructing Jonah to head east to Nineveh and warn them of their imminent destruction. Jonah decides he's going to head west to Tarshish. Yahweh interrupts Jonah's escape plan with a storm at sea. Jonah asks to be thrown into the sea. Jonah has been thrown into the sea. He survives drowning, and he's rescued in a very unexpected way. He spends 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a large sea creature. Jonah reaches out to God while he's there, and he recalls how he got to where he was, and he remembers and returns to following Yahweh's call. The fish is then directed by God to release Jonah on dry land. And now we step into chapter 3. Verse 1, the word of Yahweh came to Jonah the second time. Get up, go to Nineveh, the great city, and call out to it this very call, which I'm going to speak to you. I'm going to tell you what to tell them, Jonah. So what does Jonah, fresh out of the belly of the sea monster at the bottom of the sea, do? Verse 3, Jonah got up and went to Nineveh, according to the word of Yahweh. Now, Nineveh was an exceedingly great city. It was a 3 days walk to get all the way around it. And so now Jonah is going into that city. I want you to note 2 things as we get here. Nineveh was a great city. Well, what made it great? 5 things I noted about it was Genesis 10 tells us that Nineveh was founded and established by Nimrod, one of the descendants of Noah's son Ham. This capital city of Assyria was very well populated. It had a 60-mile circumference all the way around with a 20-foot wall backed up by a 33-foot wall that was almost 50 feet thick. You would almost say they're somewhat impenetrable. It had jaw-dropping palaces and enormous statues of pure gold. It was located at a junction for those crossing the Tigris River on the great roadway, sometimes called the Silk Road, between the Mediterranean Sea and the Indian Ocean. This united the east and west of the known world at that time. The Ninevites received wealth from many sources, and they had a fierce and ruthless military. They were a great city. Well, this is what Jonah was walking into, this place. I really want to say this wasn't the Jonah we met in chapter 1, who ran from God's call, wound up in the belly of a great sea creature. He now stands bleached and ready for anything life can throw at him. That's what I want to say, but I can't glamorize, overemphasize, or romanticize this biblical character. And I'll have to show you why a little later. After being in Nineveh for about a day, Jonah gives his message. 40 days and Nineveh will be overthrown. You will be destroyed in about 6 weeks. It's over for you people. I can hear all the emphasis that he had. Every fiber of his body was like, I'm with this program. Kill them, get them all. He might have told them how Yahweh visited Sodom and Gomorrah to see if their sin was exceedingly bad. Well, Yahweh couldn't find 10 righteous people there. And so, except for Lot, his wife and daughters, Yahweh rained on Sodom and Gomorrah fire and brimstone, and they were destroyed. Jonah would have known this story from his youth. He might have seasoned that message with some history, telling the Ninevites, there was a time when your ancestors defiantly built a city and a tower against what Yahweh instructed them to do. And that prompted him to visit them at that time. And the outcome wasn't exactly what they were looking for. First story might have been intriguing to them, but the second one was a part of their history. So how did the people of Nineveh respond to Jonah's message? Verse 5 of chapter 3 says, they believed in God, called a fast, and put on sackcloth. You might have heard about people praying in sackcloth and ashes. It's a term that's used when someone is either mourning or they are humbling themselves before God. They put on sackcloth, that is an outfit made of coarse hair like goat's hair, and cover themselves in ashes. And it's often accompanied with fasting. Again, the idea is that you're in great mourning or you're humbling yourself before God. When this message reached the king of Nineveh, he got off his throne, took off his mantle, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat in ashes. He says, I need to make some changes here. So he made a decree. Let no man, animal, herd, or flock eat or drink water. Cover them with sackcloth and let men call on God with all their might, and turn from their evil ways and their violence. Change how you're living. Who knows? God may turn and relent, which means being moved to compassion, and turn away from his burning anger so we won't perish. This was the king of Nineveh, the one who sent his people out to war and do all the things that they did. So what were the Ninevites doing? They were humbling themselves, turning from their wicked ways, and praying over that 40 days. That remind you of something? If my people who are called by my name shall humble themselves and pray and turn from their wicked ways, I'll hear from heaven and heal their land. We always think God is only focused on those who know him. God is focused on those he made, which is all of them. Guess who heard from heaven? Verse 10, God saw their works and how they turned from their evil way. So God relented. He was moved to compassion concerning the destruction he was going to bring upon them, and he didn't. Let me insert something here at no additional charge. We need to be careful of some of the study notes in some of our study Bibles. Why? Well, on this particular point, many teach that God does not hear sinners when they pray, and they use John chapter 9, verse 31, which says, now we know God doesn't hear sinners or give an ear to them, as proof to support this. When you read chapter 9 from John, you'll find out this was not an instruction from our Heavenly Father. This is the word of some sanctimonious Pharisees talking about Yeshua to a blind man Yeshua had just healed. The God of heaven and earth hears, listens to, and acts upon what he chooses to. Note that in your study notes. Now, I'm going to stop here because if I go further on that point, I may have to charge. So what happened in Nineveh had to be the largest revival in the Bible among non-Hebrews. And Jonah was chosen to bring the message. He must have been, overly ecstatic at seeing God work like this and turn these people around. Well, not so much. We're about to find out the real reason why Jonah didn't want to go to Nineveh in the first place. In chapter 4 of Jonah, it says, what was happening is when the Ninevites turned to God, this may be hard for you if you're not reading along, but when the Ninevites turned to God, to Jonah, this was a great evil. He became angry. Jonah was hot as Houston in the summer. Say, what? Yes, so much he prayed, Yahweh, wasn't this my word to myself when I was in my land? This is why I didn't want to come here. This is why I was going to Tarshish. For I knew, watch for it, you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness, and one who relents is moved to compassion concerning evil. And again, this comes from Exodus 34, verse 6, where Yahweh describes himself to Moses. But you know, that's not all. Jonah continues and he says, "Oh, Yahweh, heal me." All right, that's my interpretation or translation. He says it like this: "Please take my life from me, for death is better to me than life." So Yahweh asks, do you have a good reason to be angry? I don't think this is how a preacher is supposed to act. I really don't. This prophet has a problem. He has the same issue with the Ninevites now as he did before he ran off to Tarshish. After all he's been through, there's been no real change. Jonah was filled with the toxin of unforgiveness. Unforgiveness is often fueled by bitterness, anger, and resentment. Think about it. He's a servant and prophet of God. However, he willingly defies the God of heaven and earth. Why? Because he sees the Ninevites as enemies, and I want nothing to do with them that comes out to their good. We need to understand regarding Jonah, just because Yahweh chooses to use a person, and that means me or you, it doesn't mean everything about that person is what it should be. Remember, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. After being thrown overboard a ship into the sea, drowning and surviving that and ending up in the belly of a sea creature, when he arrives in Nineveh, Jonah demonstrates his true attitude: compassionless toward those people. I know some toxic believers. They claim to be followers of Christ, but they regularly demonstrate things in their attitude, their speech, and behaviors that isn't godly. Now, anyone can have an off moment, an off day. I get that. But those things shouldn't move for believers into years. Anyway, Jonah. Now that this message has been delivered, Jonah goes outside the city and he makes a small shelter. We would call it a sukkah, east of the city, so it can shade him. Then Jonah stops at the concession stand, picks up some popcorn, gets his frozen Coke, and he's getting ready to watch the show because he's thinking back, I'm sure, on what happened at Sodom and Gomorrah, or maybe what went on at the Tower of Babel as the 40-day clock to destruction ticked away. Well, while Jonah was watching for the show, Yahweh God appointed a plant, and it came up over Jonah to be a shade over his head, to deliver him from the discomfort of the heat. And Jonah was extremely glad about the plant that came up. I want you to write down the word appointed, which means prepared for that moment, because it's going to come up again. Verse 7, God appointed a worm, and it struck the plant and it dried up. It basically died. Then, as the sun was rising, God appointed a scorching east wind, and the sun was so hot on Jonah's head, he began to get a little faint. I'd almost say a little heat stroke. How did Jonah respond to all this? Kill me! What is up with this guy? I mean, he asked with all his soul to die. He says, death is better to me than life, than to see these people get turned around. Wow. Then God asked Jonah, do you have a good reason to be angry about the plant? And then Jonah, I don't get this guy. He says, I've got good reason to be angry even to death. He is so caught up in himself, he can't see that God is showing compassion toward him. We've seen Jonah in real life. That's how the story pretty much ends. God is talking to him about the people there and why he should show them compassion. Jonah was a prophet with a problem, unforgiveness. He didn't like the fact that Yahweh would be gracious to whom he would be gracious, or show compassion to whom he chose to show compassion. Exodus 33:19. Jonah thought he would choose a domino run. Remember the domino effect? He thought he would choose a domino effect that would exclude Nineveh as if he has something to do with it. But isn't that like us sometimes? Thinking we're going to strong arm God by our participation or lack thereof in something he's called us to do. I remind you, he will appoint the right thing to get you and me to return to the path he's laid out before us. Jonah really wanted the Ninevites to be destroyed. That's why he didn't want to warn them. He knew there was a clock on them, and he wanted them to be brought down. He didn't see them as God saw them. People who didn't know the difference between their right hand and their left. The Ninevites didn't know God or his ways. However, when the belly-bleached Noah brought the message and Yahweh uncovered their blindness to the truth, they repented, they turned, they changed their ways. Now, perhaps the Spirit of God brought someone to mind that you don't care for at all. If so, that's a problem. I'm going to ask you to forgive them. I didn't say become their BFF. No, I'm asking you to, by faith, forgive them and forget avenging yourself. Forget doesn't mean act like the hurt or betrayal never took place. It means don't bring it up as a charge against them. You know, the way the Father does us. How can I ask this of you? My brothers, my sisters, my friends. I base it on Luke chapter 6, verse 27 and 28. Yeshua says, to you who are willing to listen, I say, love your Ninevites. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who hurt you. And I don't mean pray that they get run over by a Mack truck. No. Friends, don't avenge yourselves. Romans 12:19. Leave that for God's wrath, because vengeance is mine. I will repay, says Yahweh. If justice is needed, leave it up to Yahweh. Why do I say that? Because holding unforgiveness fueled by anger, bitterness, and resentment against someone is like you drinking poison and waiting for them to die. Leave the Ninevites in your life to God. Show compassion when and where you can is the path God calls you and I to. Don't let the domino effect in your life lead you to the bottom of the sea, to the belly of a big fish. Shalom.